So this is the Moog Subharmonicon. This is a 2-oscillator monosynth with a low-pass filter, 2 envelopes, and then this sequencer section. So the idea here is that we build a kind of more complex sound by dividing the frequency of the 2 main oscillators. So each oscillator has 2 sub-levels. So we have our main oscillators, the waveforms can be switched from square waves to sawtooths, and then we have this kind of special pulse width modulation wave, which is the sawtooth of sub-level number 1 modulating the pulse width of the main oscillator. So if I change the frequency of sub-level number 1, then we will get a different kind of overtone. Down here we have these 3 level controls for the main oscillators and then the 2 sub-levels. As we start to go up, we can actually load this a bit harder into the filter, and that will overload this low-pass filter. This is a kind of classic Moog style low-pass ladder filter. We do get that kind of bass roll-off as we introduce the resonance, which actually in this kind of setup kind of works quite nicely because there's a lot of kind of information going on in the with these sub-levels. So yeah, by using these sub-levels, we are able to create these kind of complex kind of chords. The 2 envelopes are just simple kind of attack decay envelopes when we're using these internal sequencers. We can actually use MIDI with this as well, so when we use MIDI, you can hold the note so it's more like an attack sustain release. And one is hard rooted to the filter, which we have an attenuator here for. This is bipolar attenuverter, sorry. So moving on to the sequencers, we have 2 4-stage sequencers, one of which, the top one controls oscillator number 1 and the second one controls oscillator number 2. We do have the outputs here on the patch bay, so you could reroute those if you wanted to, but you can also just assign either the subs or the main oscillator to the sequencers. So by using 2 simple 4-stage sequencers and then this polyrhythm kind of generator at the bottom here, we're able to create these kind of longer phrases and interesting kind of cyclical phrases. So at the moment you can see I've just got a simple thing, so I've got for every 2 stages that sequencer number 1 moves, I'll get 1 movement on sequencer number 2. Now I can use, at the moment I'm not using these polyrhythm number 4, 3 or 4, so I can add these in and create a much more kind of interesting polyrhythmic sequence. But essentially these are just divisions, these rhythms are just divisions of the master tempo. So if I want to go all the way up to the master tempo, now this is the main kind of sequencer tempo. But by mixing these, we create kind of the way that this moves through its 4 stages of the sequence. The range of each one of these knobs can go from plus or minus 5 volts, or plus or minus 2, or plus or minus 1. We also have a quantizer section, 4 different types of quantizing. 12-tone equal temperament, 8-tone equal temperament diatonic. Then we have 2 just intonation scales. So just intonation is an older approach to generating musical scales based around whole number ratios. Originally, the Subharmonicon was made for the engineer package at Moogfest a couple of years ago, so you may have seen a kind of iteration of this before, but this is going to be now a production model. So let's go through it and see what we can get out of it. So as the Subharmonicon is semi-modular, this does have fairly extensive patch bay over here on the right hand side, and I thought I'd add a little processing system to this and also some extra kind of modulation options and utility things. We can add some effects from the mimeophone here. Now also I can clock this from the clock output from here, so now I have a nice in time kind of delay. So yeah, we have this, we're able to process with this, and then additionally in this case over here on the right hand side I've got 3 attenuators. These will allow me to take signals from the Subharmonicon and this little modular and turn signals down. We also have some mults over here. And then we have mutable instruments peaks, which can be a number of different things. I've got some alternative firmware loaded on this as well, so it's got even more features than the original. Envelopes, LFOs, sequencers, that sort of stuff. Just general kind of modulation. From this first output, you can see this LFO here. I'm going to run that into the attenuator, and then from the attenuator, I'll go into the cutoff frequency here. Just gives us a bit more kind of movement on the cutoff frequency there. So over here on the patch bay we have access to all of the individual outputs from the subharmonics and main oscillators. So maybe I'm going to take sub output number 1, which we're not currently listening to here. Then I can run this into here, but if I have that all the way up, that's just going to be droning into my reverb and delay. So actually what I'm going to do is run a sequence. So this second sequencer, which is controlling the pitch of oscillator number 2, I'm going to run that sequence output and use that to sequence the level of this oscillator into the delay. So really, once we get a higher note we're going to hear it, but the lower notes we won't hear as much because this level will be lower. And then additionally we can do things like, so say I have a CV output from this here, and maybe I'd like to do some pulse width modulation on that second oscillator as well. So I'm going to mult this just so I've got access to it again. So go into the pulse width modulation input of oscillator number 2. Now if I just take these apart, you might be... I could do other things like, so I'm going to flip this buffer here, so that's going to give me reverse delays, but I'm going to take a trigger from the Subharmonicon to do that. Now what I'm going to do as well is take this control voltage signal here and run that into the CV input of these rhythms, because we can actually modulate these, same as these as well. We can modulate these via the patch bay. So if I go into here, then as I go up here, you can see that sequencer number 1 is going to move at the clock rate, and that's because rhythm number 4 is only controlling sequencer number 1, sorry. It just gives me a bit of variation in the sequence. And if we just want to hear what dry is going on, we just take these out, and now we're just listening to the Subharmonicon. So anyway, yeah, that's a bit of using a bit of the patch bay and additionally adding extra features with a little modular setup. I do think that the Subharmonicon really does need some effects. It's dry. It's a very dry sounding synthesizer, obviously, because it doesn't have any effects. So adding delays and reverbs, even if they were in pedal form, is going to massively increase the ability of this synthesizer to shine. So one part of this kind of synthesizer that we haven't explored yet is these kind of different quantizing sections. So we have 4 different quantizers. We have 12-tone equal temperament, and the equal temperament is more kind of standard Western tuning style system. So this would be what you're used to. 12-tone would be chromatic, and then 8-tone would be, I suppose if we're starting on a C, it would be a C major scale. If we're starting on an A, it would be an A minor. And then we come on to these just intonation. And the idea with just intonation is that the musical scale is based around like whole number ratios. So it's like the harmonic series. So in relation to subharmonics and the kind of concept of this instrument, it kind of makes sense to have just intonation as well as equal temperament. And really, it can be quite subtle, but if you listen to the difference, you can hear a difference. So we have a kind of complex chord built up. And then if we go into the equal temperament, you can hear that phasing. So I've got the filter all the way open here. And then if we go, you can hear there's a lot less beating in a just intonation, and that's because all of the ratios between each note is harmonically related, so it makes sense. It's kind of perfectly harmonically related to that root note. Now I suppose the problem, and that's why they give you equal temperament as well, and why equal temperament is a lot more popular, is that when you change key, or when you try to modulate to a different key in just intonation, everything else sounds wrong because the intonation is tuned on these root notes. So yeah, it's kind of interesting, and it's a fun way of exploring the difference between just intonation or intonation and equal temperament. So let's just have a listen to this patch. We've got the Digitact running some drums, and it's a very similar patch to that previous one where I took the sub outputs into the low pass gates here. So I have this time oscillator number 1 sub outputs going into the 2 low pass gates, and then instead of actually sequencing the Subharmonicon with the sequencers, I'm actually just sequencing the subs that are coming through these low pass gates. So the 2 clock outputs from both sequencers are going to 2 envelopes on peaks, and they're opening and closing the low pass gates. So I can switch up the rhythm of how these low pass gates are being opened and closed. You can hear now. So then the rest of the Subharmonicon's voicing is free to do this kind of chord voice, which is obviously going through the mimeophones for some delay and reverb. So instead of the sequencers on the Subharmonicon sequencing the voice, it's actually the Digitact which is playing it via MIDI. And I've also taken the sequence output of number 2 here, and that's coming back in, going through the attenuator and then coming back into the cutoff frequency up here. And then the clock output is going to clock the mimeophone. So yeah, you can just play it like a normal synthesizer with MIDI, which is quite nice. It's not tied to these sequencers, because then you could use the sequencers to sequence other parameters on the Subharmonicon or on any other kind of piece of gear that you've got, really. So the nice thing then is that you can mix and match by turning this envelope on and off for the sequencers to trigger the rest of the voicing on the Subharmonicon. You get a kind of quite nice interactive kind of thing where you're mixing both the MIDI and the sequencers together. But yeah, I mean, overall I think it's a nice sounding, interesting synthesizer. It's fairly simple in terms of what you get. It's just 2 oscillators, a low pass filter and 2 envelopes. So it's not exactly something groundbreaking, but then the way that it's presented to you in this kind of fixed patch almost, it does lend itself to exploring the territory of the parameters that you're given, and that's what kind of makes it unique. It's not trying to be everything. It's not trying to be a synthesizer to take on all things. It's doing its thing and it's doing it well. And it does sound good, you know, it sounds like Moog, which is what you want, right? Could have benefited from an extra LFO and also maybe audio input into the filter. That's kind of a shame that that's not there. So I think if you're into the sound of the Subharmonicon, then you should get it. And also if you like something that's kind of fairly conceptual, a bit exploratory, but can then also just play nicely. It's a simple thing, and it's like these simple things are creating something that's actually quite enjoyable to use. Put some headphones on, run it through a delay or a reverb, and spend a couple of hours just droning out and just listening to these polyrhythms and sequences just go over and over again. So I hope you enjoyed that, and thank you very much for watching.